Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Stephen Reid. It's nice to see so many of you virtually. This is a nice wee addition to my Saturday morning. I usually spend it going for a long run and then cleaning the toilets. So this is a kind of nice break in between. It's nice to talk about the Reformation in between those boring domestic activities. I've been working on the Reformation for almost 20 years now, which is quite scary. And I did a talk like this about 8 years ago, I think it was, Karen, when we did them. And it's amazing just looking back now on how much has changed in the past decade in terms of recent research. And again, not just in terms of the ways of thinking about the Reformation, but also maybe thinking about the content that the SQA covers. So I'll talk about that today. And the agenda for today is arranged by the SQA key issues. It's designed to be a very informal, very easygoing discussion this morning. And if you want to jump in and ask questions at any time, please just either use the hands up function, drop a message to Karen, or whatever is the easiest way for you to get in touch. I'm going to look at three broad areas today. The first is just to look very, very broadly at the new perspectives that have emerged on the Reformation in the past decade, and that's in line with topic one for the SQA. And happily enough, I've recently published a very short, easy to read article summarising the state of the field on cultures of Calvinism in early modern Scotland. And we've put a pre-publication proof, or a link to a pre-publication proof up on the teacher's website. So you're able to access this and you can read this at your leisure in a bit more detail. So I'll do that first. Then I'm going to talk about the reign of Mary. I've been doing a lot of work on Mary since about 2015, particularly looking at Mary and her afterlife in popular culture. I've been writing about her as the mother to James VI and their relationship, but my main project has been on the afterlife of Mary Queen of Scots. And one big thing I think that's emerged in the teaching that I do on the Reformation to try and make it relevant and interesting to students is to focus on image-based and material objects. Sometimes, as you'll know, Scottish Reformation texts can be a bit hard to read. They can be a bit dry. So using images and using artifacts, if you like, to engage students, I find works very, very well. We've had really successful teaching in archive-based placements doing that in Glasgow. So I'll talk about that and a website that we've set up that relates to that has lots and lots of images that you can use. So I'll talk about that project, share some images. And then for items 3 and 4, James and the relationship between the monarch and the kirk and the impact of the Reformation on Scotland to 1603 and again Scottish identity. I'm going to talk about a project that I led between 2012 and 2015, which has only just finished producing published outputs, which looked at poems produced in Latin by Scots in Jacobean Scotland between 1560 and 1625. There's a lot of poems on the website that we produced that go up to 1603. Many of them are short, very easy to read, and really engage with the idea about the church-crown relations and perceptions of James VI among his people. And there's also poems on there about Mary. So in the last 5 minutes or so of today's session, I'll show you some of those texts. Hopefully if I can get the websites to work. I would say as well that for points 2 and 4, for both of these projects, they both link into the broader item of SQA content on Mary and the Reformation, in that they think about the impact of the Reformation on Scottish identity. Particularly Mary, we see the issues of the Reformation and the idea of what it means to be Scottish reflected back to us through Mary, right through the centuries. And a lot of that's tied in to how she is in the Reformation. And then I'll leave plenty of time, about 15 minutes at the end, for questions and comments. Okay. Right, marching straight on then. So I've got the virtual background here behind me, St Andrews, and again I've got another shot of it here. Everybody knows this is the key image of the Reformation in Scotland. What I would say is there has been a lot of work and a lot of different monographs have come out over the past 10 years in relation to the Reformation. I would say generally there has been a little bit of a decline in the number of scholars working on the Scottish Reformation, and certainly in employed posts in universities. At least in Scotland, I would say. We certainly have a pickup in North American scholars working on the Reformation, and more people in England, I think, and who work within the English church historical establishment have started to engage, I think, in Scotland in a more comparative way. Some things that I think have fallen by the wayside in the past few years that you might be familiar with if you've studied the Reformation are things like the focus that we used to have on area studies. You might all be familiar with Margot Todd's work, looking at the impact of Reformed worship at the parish level in the kirks. Margot Todd's book came out in 2004, and I think it was so good and so comprehensive that it has scared people off a lot from doing further area studies. I think a further issue as well, for the issue specifically for the Reformation between 1560 and 1603, the published studies that have been done to date looking at area studies on the Reformation have really used all the printed sources, Kirk Session, Presbytery minutes, Synod minutes that exist, General Assembly minutes. They've really exhausted those studies and those printed versions. So now we have recourse to the digital or the physical manuscripts that we get in the NRS, which are available digitally by the virtual volume system there, but they're very, very hard to work with. And so for PhD students and for others, the idea of doing area studies just now, I think it's not something that's as attractive as it used to be. We used to judge the Reformation as well, I think, by the number of ministers across the country, and many older studies of the Reformation said, oh, well, by 1580, there was a minister in every kirk. I don't think that's actually true now. And John McCallum showed in his book, Looking at the Reformation of Fife, that when we talk about ministers, we have to be very careful to distinguish between an actual trained minister who can administer the sacraments, who can lead a parish, who can do marriages, can do all the things that a minister would do, and a reader, someone who is trained and literate enough to read scripture and to give a weekly lesson, but can't really provide the care of souls that a minister would. Now, in John's study and in other studies that have been done since, what's been found is that ministerial capacity in the decades after 1560 were extremely stretched. You maybe had one minister or even one reader per 4 parishes in lowland Scotland, far, far less in the Highlands and in more remote areas, more rural areas. And that does, again, affect the way we think about the Reformation. It shows that up until about 1590, even 1600, the impact and the embedding of Reformed culture on the ground really wasn't there. It was really quite patchy. And again, the documents we have tell us about the Reformation in very urban settlements like St Andrews, like Ayr, like Edinburgh. It doesn't really tell us about the broader country as a whole, where the Reformation, I think, had far less impact. There's also been less of a focus in recent studies, and indeed this is a broader trend over the past 20 years, I would say, on theology. So again, the idea of the Crown-Kirk struggle, again, something that we focus on in topic 3, is maybe something we don't focus on as much now. Certainly the confessional debates that we used to have about whether the Scottish Church was Presbyterian or Episcopal, they haven't really moved on since the work of, I would say, Jim Kirk, writing quite a while ago now. So that's something that is maybe fixed in time now, we've moved away from. So you might ask, what has replaced that? What are the kind of things we're talking about now in the Reformation current scholarship? A big thing that's emerged in monographs and in journals, articles that have come out in the past few years is the idea of continuity of a long 16th century with lived experience, educational experience, the management of the country, really not changing that much between the break of the Reformation and afterwards. So I'll just see. So that's something that has changed quite a lot. I think in my own studies on education, the universities really don't move on from their scholastic medieval past until right up to the end of the 16th century. Amy Blakeway has shown in her book on Regency that the governance of Scotland, which, as you'll know, was frequently affected by the fact that the monarch was underage and had to be governed by a regent, that didn't really change. The way they governed didn't change. How they were elected changed, but the way they governed didn't change much. And John McCallum again produced a really excellent collection of essays on Scotland's long Reformation, looking at things like property right, the survival of Catholic belief, and the slowness of discipline to engage in Scotland, and showed that really, culturally, Scotland still maintained a lot of its lived experience daily with its pre-Reformation past. Some interesting ways that things have moved on as well, new directions for research, I think. There's definitely a new appreciation of material culture, of looking at the objects of, say, church discipline, of looking at the remnants of religious art and architecture, of looking at the relics that belong to Mary. And that's really interesting because it can really be used to engage students very effectively. There's a real interest in everyday life, not just how people were punished in the Kirk session, but female power, female agency, both in law courts and before the Kirk session. We have the idea of price inflation and how that affects the everyday person. And the most recent and most interesting set of textbooks that have been done on Scottish history are a history of everyday life in Scotland. And there's a good book on medieval Scotland, I think that was edited by Lizanne Henderson and Ted Cowan, which is good to look at. In relation to that, there's been a lot of work done on the social function of the ministry, not just punishing, but acting as a positive force in Scottish society. And John McCallum and Chris Langley, not Chris Newman, it's Chris Langley at Newman, I should say, have both produced a range of studies on poor relief and social care, looking at how the Kirk was very effective at dispensing alms and looking after the poorest people in society. And Chris Langley's also led an amazing database-driven project looking at how the ministry lived between 1560 and about 1660, thinking about the ways that they married, the parishes they stayed in, where they were educated, who their friends were, and that's really interesting. One of the most fascinating books that I think has come out has been Elizabeth Rhodes' Riches and Reform, which traced the property rights in St Andrews and looked at where all the money went in the church after the Reformation. And again, she showed that, again, we think of the Reformation as a terminal point, but really the sale of ecclesiastical property, of the land in St Andrews and the people making money off it, that started to change hands in 1520 with the process of leasing out church lands known as feuing, and it continued right after the Reformation, right through into the 16th century. So very interesting ways to look at this. And Miles Kerr-Peterson's also been looking at noble life in Reformed Scotland, and his study of George Keith Earl Marshall, who was by his own words, a very boring noble, someone who wasn't particularly Protestant or hardline Protestant and wasn't Catholic, but got on with his business, came to court when he needed, and was very wealthy. Miles has argued that we need more noble studies like that to understand how the Reformation really impacted noble society and culture. So there is a lot going on. Definitely a move away from some of the trends and ideas that we see in the SQA content, I think, which is, again, maybe drawing off of slightly older scholarship. So what I'll do now is move on to the first of two case studies we're going to look at today that both have websites, and I'll put the links up to the websites afterwards in the chat. And the first is looking at the reign of Mary Queen of Scots. And this is drawing on my own project, In My End is My Beginning, the memorialisation and cultural afterlife of Mary Queen of Scots. Now, this project started about 6 years ago now, 5-6 years ago, and it began with this painting here that you can see on screen. It's Gavin Hamilton's The Abdication of Mary Queen of Scots, and it was produced in the mid-17th century. Gavin Hamilton was a very famous neoclassical artist, Scot-born, working in Rome. The patron of the painting was James Boswell. And Andrew Lowe, who is one of the curators in the Hunterian, came to me and said, well, I'd quite like to do a small exhibition around this one painting. And at the time, I was doing a lot of work with George Heriot in terms of teaching, and I was also doing a placement-based course in Glasgow, looking at objects relating to Mary, and what we had in our university archives. And so I said, there's actually a lot more in the university archives than we think relating to Mary, and this would be of interest. So we started exploring with a team at Glasgow what we had in the university archives. We found hundreds of objects relating to Mary. And then for the next phase, we decided, well, why don't we see what else there is in Scottish archives and heritage collections more generally? And then the RSC were very kind enough to fund a 2-year project that was supposed to finish in February, but has been extended until just this month due to COVID. And we got in touch with all the curators across Scotland, the National Trust, National Library, National Museum, and we asked them to provide censuses, go into their archives and produce censuses of what they owned in relation to Mary. Not so much text, but physical objects. And then we married them up with a range of specialist experts in Mary's history to try and construct a narrative of this. And the key questions we've been asking is, how does Mary's death in her afterlife, how does it change over time? Using Mary as a lens, what does that tell us about changing attitudes to gender and monarchy and religion in Scotland over the past 5 centuries? What does the way that we present her in Scotland, what does that tell us about Scottish identity? So in an era when, for example, Catholicism is banned, how is Mary represented in terms of her religion? In an era like the Georgian period, where female identity is very circumscribed, how is Mary presented? And the question that's always interested me, why are people so interested in Mary? Has that interest always been there? Has it been constant? Some questions we've asked are, why is there such a unique interest in objects relating to her? And what is a true portrait of Mary? Now, what we produced in COVID last year was a website, In Search of Mary Queen of Scots, a blog-based website funded by the Centre for Scottish and Celtic Studies. We couldn't have public or face-to-face workshops for the project, so we had a whole series of online ones. And then we invited contributors to write short blogs on various aspects of Mary's cultural afterlife. And we linked it to a Twitter account at In Search of MQS. The website's online. I'll put the link in the chat for you, but it's got over 38 very easy to read blogs on everything from Mary's tapestries, Mary's tennis court at Falkland, through to Mary in film and Mary in drag. Any of you watch Drag Race, you'll maybe know Rosé, the Scots-born drag queen who presented himself as Mary Queen of Scots and caused a bit of a media sensation earlier this year. But there's a lot of stuff on this website that I think would really engage students, particularly students in the upper end of the school. And again, there's a lot of contemporary relevant stuff. It's tied to film, it's tied to things like Reid, the TV show, but it also uses the objects from Mary's own time to tell that story and to get you to think about her religion, about her Frenchness, about her gender and what that meant in the 16th century. We've also got a massive open online course on this whole topic launching in November. It's going to launch November the 22nd. The first 2 weeks are dedicated to going through Mary's life, and the last week is dedicated to going through Mary's afterlife. And that's completely free to sign up for. It's a 3-week course, and anybody can join that. So I'm going to share some of the objects with you, some of the material culture, and there are many more examples on the website you can use in your teaching. I'm going to just sketch out, this is the key part of my research on the project, understanding Mary's image and how that changes over time, and how that links to her religion. So I'm just going to give you a very potted history in images of how Mary's vision, or the vision of Mary, changes. We start with these two known earliest portraits of her from the Bibliothèque Nationale in the Royal Collection, which is in Holyrood. These are early portraits of Mary at about 6 and 16 respectively. You'll notice immediately that this is the Mary that we know. She's got the strong nose, the slightly jowly chin. She's got the high forehead. She's also got the very tight curls in her head. And even at this stage, you can see she's got the veil that will become a big part of her signature look. She's got the hazel eyes as well. There are no portraits of Mary from her personal reign in Scotland, which I find fascinating. Either we couldn't recruit Scottish artists, or she was just too busy going on progress and dealing with people like Huntley and Murray to actually sit for a portrait. But when she goes to England, we do have 2 portraits that might be actual examples. This engraving from John Leslie's 10 books on the history of Scotland, which I think is based on this engraving here, which is from the Royal Collection again. It's an engraving by the very famous Elizabethan engraver, Nicholas Hilliard. And you can see the physical parallels in these between the earlier portraits. You can see that Mary's put on weight because she's in captivity, but you can see the chin has fallen, which again tracks back to what she looks like earlier. Still a strong nose, still the same hazel eyes, the same forehead, the same curls. Now, when Mary is executed, a whole range of images spawn that create the Mary that we know today. It's like Burns portraits or Bonnie Prince Charlie portraits, but on a much larger scale. The one you're probably most famous with when you think of Mary, and if you ask your students to draw a Mary, this is probably what they would draw. Mary in her black dress with her cap, possibly with a ruff, and with a cross. And this comes from what's known as the Sheffield portrait type. There were variants just like this produced in the decades on either side of 1600. There's one here from the National Portrait Gallery. The one in the top is from the Royal Collection, and the one at the bottom is from the Borough Collection. You'll see that iconography is very fixed. Some of them have more detail in the crucifixes. The big picture on the slide there's a very small tableau in the crucifix Mary's holding of Susanna and the elders. And Susanna's unjustly accused of adultery by a group of elders in her community. And eventually she is vindicated thanks to Daniel, and her persecutors are killed. So it's a motto for her life, if you like. And in the one at the top there, the Royal Portrait at the Royal Collection, you can just see at the bottom corner there, you can see Mary in her red bodice about to be executed in Fotheringhay. And over that picture, there's a whole range of little text boxes in Latin, talking about her life, talking about her suffering at the hands of Elizabeth, who's called a savage butcher, and saying how she dies as a great daughter of Rome and a faithful daughter of the Roman faith. So these images, initially commissioned, we believe, by Mary's handmaid, Elizabeth Curl, and then disseminated by other portrait artists, are important for communicating an image of Mary to an elite audience. But I would argue that the global image that we have of Mary comes from woodprints, from woodcuts, from cheap engraved prints that are disseminated in the late 16th and early 17th century. They can be made using a block of wood or a litho print and put on a printing press very easily. They're technology that can be reused again and again in very straightforward ways. And we find that, for example, with this engraving here, that they're either printed as a separate broadsheet, as you can see on the left-hand side, or they're inserted into the front page of a book textually. The one there is at the front of Adam Blackwood's History of Mary's Life and of her martyrdom. Again, they can be added to and changed. So the one in the Blackwood picture is just very plain. But the one in the Thomas de Leeuw engraving has, again, a Latin poem at the bottom detailing Mary's life. And it has a range of iconography dictating her execution in the bottom half of the page, and then angels above her in the top. Now, as that image gets fixed and goes on in the 17th century, it changes and becomes more elaborate. By the mid-17th century, you're getting engravings like this, where there are angels in a saint's crown being added into the picture with Mary. You're getting a more strident claim. This is an engraving from Catholic Europe, where there are 4 crowns at her feet. And again, they're the crowns of France, England, Ireland, and Scotland. Again, this is something very interesting to throw at students and say, why is Mary being depicted like this? We've also got her here with the paraphernalia of her execution. She's got a cross and the axe, which is used to kill her as well. Now, by the 18th century, you're still getting that image. You're still getting those accessories, if you like, being used. But the images have become so diluted that Mary no longer looks anything like Mary. I mean, you look at these 2 portraits, you know that it's meant to be Mary you're looking at because of the dress and the cap and the paraphernalia, but these don't look anything like the original historic portraits of Mary. And from there, the image of Mary that we have, right down to today, has been adapted and readapted, but it's always used these same iconographic features. So it's an interesting case study in media and presentation. We also get, for Mary, and again, this is good to engage students, personal relics. Mary's left a range of relics, some of which are true and some of which are false. And it's great fun to play with the students to say, do you think this is a real one or not? Top one there is a lock of her hair, which was given by the Lord Belhaven to Queen Victoria in the 19th century. It's on display in the Royal Collection, but it's pure white, so it's very hard to tell if this is Mary's. And it was kept in that silver box that you can see in the top corner. We've got 2 examples here as well of beds that were believed to belong to Mary. The red bed, which was actually the bed of the daughter of the Marquis of Hamilton, who was the keeper of Holyrood Palace in the 17th and 18th century. And a housekeeper in the 18th century started taking tours around Holyrood and saying that this was Mary's bed. And from there, the story became attached to it, and it persisted until the mid-20th century. The bed and the cradle in the other picture are at Trickware House in Peeblesshire, but they are not, it's not a real Mary's bed. It's a bed from the House of Maxwell just down the road. And the cradle, there's no clear attribution I can see that suggests it's James's. But it's interesting that they're portrayed as Marian relics. And another good one to show students as well are Mary's tapestries, because they are full of symbolism that you can get the students to talk about. You'll notice the top one that she produced many of these in captivity. And at the top here, we've got a cat and a mouse. We've got Mary's cipher in the corner there, the blue kind of cross that looks like an M. You'll notice as well that the cat is ginger and it's got a ginger wig. That's obviously an intentional thing. It's meant to be Elizabeth, and the mouse at her feet's meant to be Mary. Again, it's great to get students to talk about these things. And you can also get them to think about what these images say. So Mary's mottos in all these images talk about her virtue being under fire, about suffering, about having hope even though you're in captivity. And they often use her images, fruit flowering, marigold, to show she's got hope of escaping from captivity. It's a good way to get into her head, if you like. One of the most interesting ones, of course, is her death mask. And again, you can look at this in the way that it's developed. We've got a plaster death mask from her tomb in Westminster. We've got two versions of a wax death mask that belonged in Hamilton, in Lennox-Love, the Hamilton House at Lennox-Love, and another version in Jedburgh in Mary Queen of Scots house. And we've got a wooden version of the plaster mask that is on the roof in Abbotsford, Walter Scott's house, where he also had a painting of her severed head. Now, what's interesting about these is, firstly, you've got two very different versions of the painted one, one that's completely unadorned and one that has a wig and lipstick, which is very interesting. But again, none of these look the same. These could all be completely different women, and there are various different aspects to Mary. So again, this is a good way to show the students that Mary, there's as much myth in her story as there is truth. And we have to be very careful when we're looking at her to understand that everything in her life, both in it and afterwards, is very partisan and really manipulated. It's very hard to be objective with Mary. Now, in the last 5 minutes, I just want to touch on a project that I developed between 2012 and 15, looking at Scottish Neo-Latin poetry in the 16th and 17th century. Now, you might ask, well, why on earth would you do something like that? That sounds awful. But I think, bear with me, it was Scotland's second largest language, and in many ways its largest in terms of an international print audience. And we really needed to engage with this because people were writing a lot about literature in Scotland without looking at all these poems that Scots produced in Latin. And many of the famous Scots poets that we work with in this period also were producing poems in Latin. So this project was an attempt to try and break into that, because that Latin culture really grew to its height after the Reformation and reached its zenith in James's reign. And so we produced 350,000 words of text, translation, and critical apparatus from a volume known as the Dilitiae Poetarum Scotorum, which was an anthology of 1,200 pages of these poets that was produced for international dissemination. On the website, you can do a free text search. Everything is rendered in plain English, and there's also about 20 short research essays on all sorts of aspects of literary and intellectual culture in Jacobean Scotland, and these can be very easily cited and used by students. I updated it and re-edited it again in 2020 for our ref exercise, but we also have now published a collection of these poems from James VI's reign with further edits, comparing them to all the manuscript versions that exist, which we weren't able to do for this project. What I want to do now is just come out of that and I'll go on to the website itself. So just give me 2 seconds. Okay, so again, it's very easy. All you've got to do on this website is you can use the links at the side. And again, we have a whole range of articles here on George Buchanan, on poets like Hercules Rollick, explaining an account of the Marian Civil War, which really details the blood and gore of the whole conflict. It brings it to life very vividly for students. We've got stuff on Andrew Melville as well. But you can also search, if you go into the electronic resource, you can just go to search and do a free text search. So we'll start with Mary Queen of Scots. He hopes this works. Yes, there we go. So immediately, what we have on the website, we have a whole range of birth poems, 3 poems about the birth of James VI. These are really good sources for the Crown-Kirk conflict, because in each of these poems by Patrick Adamson and by Thomas Craig of Rickerton and by George Buchanan, what we get is a range of views saying that James will be a godly monarch. We will raise him as a Protestant monarch. We will raise him in a way that his mother didn't get raised in, and we will do that very well. You find poems about James's coronation. This is the only, where is it now? It's down here, I think. Yes, so this is the only poem here that's ever written on James's coronation in 1567. But it's also a poem that talks about the Battle of Carberry Hill. It's written by a student of George Buchanan's, Thomas Maitland, and it has a lot of really good lines in it about executing a king. There's a couple of really good short snippets that you can use to say to students, this is the kind of material that they were talking about. And poets were saying that kings should be deposed or killed if they misbehaved. If I go back to the search results, and I'll go down to show you just a very short example. So I can find Melville. I'll go, it's not there, but I'll go back up to Melville here. If we go back, you can browse the poets as well. So if I go to Andrew Melville, you've got various poems here about the church crown struggle, but you've also got things like the nice little epitaph he writes about Mary Queen of Scots. This is a good wee text to show students because it's written for the book that he publishes on James's accession to the crown in 1603. So it's put in a poetic account of all the Scottish kings back to Fergus I. But it shows you what they were thinking about Mary around about 1600. The fact that she's descended from ancestral kings, she's connected to France, England, and Scotland. She put spirit into men and drove them to great excitement. Her best achievement, this poem argues, is to give the sceptres of rule to her son. And then it's got this great line at the end: 3 times married and bereft of 3 men, Francis II, Darnley and Bothwell, I leave behind 3 kingdoms. A Frenchman, the Guise and Henry III have her wealth. A Scot has my cradle, James VI, and an Englishwoman has my tomb. So these kind of lines, you can kind of take short poems like this and put them before the students and get them to think about it. And all the poems have detailed contextual notes as well that you can use. So you can go on to that. You can also look up James VI because he's a major feature of these. There's a cracking poem on the website about his wedding, when the Earl Marshal goes and has a ceremony on his behalf in Denmark and gets very, very drunk. There's a whole range of poems about people at his court as well. And there's all sorts of things in Robert Ayton, who's an English-Scots poet who goes down with James, that you can engage with. So there's a whole range of stuff. You can also look for things like tyranny. And you'll find that we get all these kind of things coming up. So again, this is Melville writes a short poem on tyranny called Classicum. It's about 2 lines. You've got Buchanan's, the poem that he puts in Buchanan's History of Scotland, where he says that tyranny is terrible. And you've got his big poem on Anne's coronation, when he talks about, again, about how kings should be removed from power if necessary. So all these things can be read and used, and they can be cut up and used in different ways as well. So that's one of the websites. I'll switch now to the Mary Queen of Scots website as well, just to show you that. And again, this is what it looks like. The blog is here. I hope if it will come up. Here we are. Yes, so our most recent one's on Donizetti's Maria Stuarda. We've got the music, but we've got a whole range of objects at the V&A. And this is a great one. This is one by a student who'd actually done school trips, and she was telling us about learning about Mary at school. So it's a very interesting one to share with the students. Okay, I'll stop sharing now, but I'll put the links to those into the chat just now, just so you can get a look at them. And then I'll just take that. So there we go. If everybody jumps on the Mary site, it may crash, but I'll put that up there, and then I'll put the DPS one up as well. So let me see. copy that, and I will put that here. Okay. Now, I do have a whole range of other sources and resources I'd be happy to share. We did start doing a textbook on Mary a couple of years back with Paul Goldman, and we have a range of files that I'll put up on the History in Schools website. I've also got a whole range of material culture, images and objects that I couldn't do for time today, that are in the broader set of slides that I've given Karen for this week. They give you a whole range of images to do with James as a child. So hopefully these things are of use. And that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but there's a range of electronic resources you can engage with directly. And if you've got any questions, I'm happy to take them.